coming today. We're doing this on Facebook Live at the same time as this great audience of health professionals and you can feel. And it's going to be in two parts. I'm going to do the start. My name's James Woledge and this is the Abbeyfields Clinic. And my colleague Dr. Chandraraj is going to do the second part, and we are going to keep the video running, so there's going to be a bit of a time for questions in between while we rush around laptops and do things. And the first bit, as you can see, is going to be sleep, obesity and inflammation. Some people get a bit confused that an osteopath talks about this sort of stuff, but as I've got a little older, I've realised that these are key aspects to me trying to help people, particularly with chronic pain. At the end, we're going to do some questions, and I think it's probably, we're not going to do them on Facebook Live. We're going to do those as emails, so you can email me any questions afterwards on Facebook to james@theabbeyfieldsclinic.co.uk, and I'll be happy to answer those questions with Dr. Chandraraj. So, if we start off, it's now, the issue of sleep has become what the World Health Organization would say is becoming an epidemic. And if we go back to 1942 in this country, 8% of people were getting less than 6 hours sleep, and now it's thought to be 50% of people. And the key amount of hours we think is necessary is 7 to 9, and most trials that keep coming out on this, it's 7 to 9. If people say they can get less than 7 and they function okay, all the evidence tells us that we're wrong. We should be getting 7 to 9. There is this accepted link now that if you, for every hour that you reduce your sleep, you are going to reduce your life expectancy. This is pretty depressing, but it is actually the case. This is a nice study that was on identical twins, so genetically nigh on, absolutely the same. So they accounted for different things, but yet if one twin had reduced sleep compared to its other twin, they were looking at 17 to 24% less, or more risk of death for less than 7 hours. So an early life expectancy. So what controls our sleep? We've got two things really: the build-up of sleep pressure, and this is something called adenosine, which is a neurotransmitter that builds up in the brain, attaches to receptors in the brain, and it's like a balloon that fills up during the day. And at some point, that balloon will be the thing that makes you feel under pressure to go to sleep. And what happens is that neurotransmitter goes around your brain and it switches bits of the brain off, like going around your house and saying, turn the lights off, turn the lights off, turn the lights off. And you will feel drowsy and want to go to sleep. So you need this big build-up of adenosine through the day. The other thing that comes in is circadian rhythms, which most people have heard of. And that is going from day to night, going from light to dark. And what is the main player with that is melatonin, which most people have heard of. And melatonin and serotonin, its twin sister, they work in tandem. Serotonin is what you get with light receptors in the back of your eyes say you're awake, you need to be doing what you need to do, and everything responds. Along with cortisol, which we'll talk about a bit later. So cortisol and serotonin are the things that pick you up and make you going through the day. At the end of the day, melatonin then should be rising up. And the more melatonin you get, or the more melatonin you have in your brain, along with the adenosine, the more you will feel sleepy. So both those two things need to be taking place. The problem is that cortisol, which is a hormone that we need for everyday life, you need to have low cortisol to have high melatonin. The two are antagonistic to each other. So if you have high cortisol, you subsequently won't have high melatonin. That's what cortisol does. So you can have all the adenosine you want, but you also need a good circadian rhythm to back that up. And if you haven't got that, then you will struggle. So this is just a general overview of what we now know to be. I'm not a sleep scientist, so don't ask me any questions about this too much, but we go through 4 cycles a night, roughly 90 minutes each, where we dip into very non-REM deep sleep, of which there's 4 stages of, and what we really want to do is get into this very deep delta phase sleep. This is the stuff where if you wake up in the morning and you think, wow, that's just the greatest sleep. It's not necessarily the quantity that you've had, it's the fact that you've been allowed to, and that's kind of the key one here. If you've got enough melatonin, enough adenosine, you will go into a super deep sleep and fully recover from whatever you've been doing that day. There's lots of things that will stop that happening though. REM sleep, as most people know, is when you start to do a bit of dreaming. And REM is dominant in the early morning, which is why you sometimes wake up and can remember your dreams, because that's most dominant in the early morning. The deep phase sleep, as you can see, there's really the first 3 hours of the night. So people that go to bed late sometimes can chop off their deep phase sleep. It tends to be the people that go to bed a bit earlier and wake a bit earlier, they get all the benefits of the deep phase sleep. So, what do those two phases do for us in reality? The non-REM, the deep sleep, the early phase of the night, we get these things released called growth hormone and testosterone, whether you're female or male. And they're both very important for tissue repair. So everyone knows that sleep is really recovering from the day before. And so when you go training, and there's lots of personal trainers in here, when you train and when you injure tissue, which is what you're doing when you train really hard, if you don't get really good sleep, you're not going to take much advantage of that. You don't increase growth hormone and testosterone after your training session. It only really gets secreted at night. So a lot of people focus on having a protein bar afterwards, like me, or a sausage roll. But really, the most important thing if you're going to train really hard is that you really focus on getting a really good sleep at night. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to take advantage of the training that you did during the day. Greater immune activity. When you're asleep, your body decides it's going to spend all of its energy trying to go around the body mopping up things that there shouldn't be there. So your immune system is really switched on and it deals with things that you don't want. Purges adenosine. When you go into really deep phase sleep, your balloon that's built up with this adenosine, it basically gets rid of it. So your body will say, well, that's enough now, and we need to start the next day fresh with a completely flat balloon. If you don't purge adenosine fully by getting this deep sleep, that's the sort of stuff where you wake up in the morning feeling a bit groggy. You don't feel like you've really had a good sleep. There's something, but you've had 8 hours, looking at what I've had 8 hours, but I don't feel like I've had a good quality sleep. And that's because you've still got this stuff floating around in the system. The REM sleep. That has its part to play, not so much in the physical aspects of recovery, but also mostly to do with memory and emotion. And we can store memories. Memories are put into long-term storage with REM sleep. So whatever you've been doing through the day, your brain's very good at packing it away into chunks so that you can remember things later on. Emotional IQ fuels creativity. The SAM and VAM conversion has got a lot of press over the last 5 to 10 years because SAM is a situational attentional memory. So people that have had trauma like car accidents or PTSD and so forth, it's really important that you can convert the emotion that you feel with your memory into just being able to talk about the trauma without feeling all of the trauma that goes with it. And that happens in REM sleep. And it happens whether it's small trauma, as I say, car accident, or emotions in your life and so forth. It allows you to be able to tackle those much better if you're getting good bouts of REM sleep, 3 or 4 efforts of it a night. So some of the medications that are used for PTSD and so forth, they're trying to get people to sleep better and to get more REM sleep, and that's what drives that conversion in a healthy way. So what we know from the research, anything less than 7 hours will increase your susceptibility to become obese. It simply does. And it might be, well, there are lots of reasons for that, we'll talk about that in a minute, but ultimately 25% more likely to become obese. And this was the biggest study ever done. It was a prospective study, and what that means is they're looking at a whole bunch of people, thousands of people that are not obese. And then they track them over 1, 2, 3 years. And then they come back and say, so they start asking questions at the start and said, what's your sleep like? And they say this, and then they come back 3 years later, they measure their waist circumference in particular, because visceral fat's the most important one of obesity. And then they found out that if you had pretty poor sleep over 3 years, it's a quarter more likely you're going to be fat, obese, and unhealthy with it. So, and they did, most of these studies, they also removed aspects of what was your diet like. So there weren't, are there any what we call confounding factors in? It really was just narrowed down to sleep was the difference, nothing else. So how does that work? How does poor sleep lead to issues of putting on weight? So the first thing, the hormones that control hunger. So most important one we think is leptin, and the more leptin you have in your brain on your hypothalamus tells you you don't need to eat anymore. And unfortunately, that seems to be reduced on one night's poor sleep. Leptin will be reduced. So that's one thing to consider. The second one is ghrelin, which has been around a little bit in the press recently. That's secreted by your stomach, and the more of that does the opposite of leptin, they work in tandem. The more of that will tell you that you definitely need to eat. What we do know is that they're both evolutionary drives, which is not helpful, because what that means is that they will send messages mostly about making more food choices, but making really poor food choices. Leptin does that. Leptin's produced by your fat cells, and ultimately it will make you go for the sausage roll in the morning. and it'll make you go for fatty, high-calorie rich foods. So the other thing as well, cortisol, we're coming back to again. This is it gets bad press, but we need cortisol. Cortisol is part of your fight, and flight response. It increases your blood pressure, gets you going in the morning, the awakening response. You need a good boost of it in the morning, and then it needs to settle down a little bit through until the evening. So when that reduces, if you remember that graph a minute ago, as that reduces, melatonin's allowed to come up. But if you're getting disturbed sleep and not great sleep, you're not very good at resetting your cortisol levels. And cortisol over time will lead to all of those things that you only want in a fight, and flight situation, because you want more blood sugar, you want more blood pressure. But unfortunately, over time, it doesn't play out well, because your body will say, we've got all these blood sugars floating around, what are we going to do with them? And ultimately, you will store them. And what we know, unfortunately, about visceral fat around the abdomen is there are lots of receptors for cortisol. So you get a maturation, which is of the fat cells in the abdomen, and whatever blood sugar or whatever excess energy you've got floating around the system, you will deposit it in your visceral fat. And visceral fat does lots of nasty things. Along with that, cortisol, because it wants to raise your blood sugar levels to run away from whatever it is that we're running away from, or general chronic stress that we're having now, it reduces insulin resistance. So insulin you put into the system to make the blood sugar go into the cells. And ultimately cortisol is an antagonist to that. It says, no, you're not going to do that. So you have this free-floating blood sugar going around, which is what you see your GP for, it tests you for blood sugar and says, actually, things are getting a bit out of hand here. It's cortisol and insulin working in tandem. It's not just about insulin. When this gets into a chronic state, then we can start developing something called metabolic syndrome. It's basically the combination of the fact that you've got elevated blood pressure pretty much all the time because of cortisol. You've got your blood sugar levels going up because insulin is no longer having a great effect. And you've got this central obesity, which is your visceral fat. Those three things combined now underpin most of the chronic diseases we know, from cardiovascular disease through to Alzheimer's and through to ultimately getting things like type 2 diabetes. So that is your precursor metabolic syndrome to things going not well. And most of it is underpinned by diet, yes, which we're not here today to talk about, but most of it then is underpinned by things like sleep and chronic stress. Obstructive sleep apnea I've put here because alongside the fact that you put on a bit of weight, this white fat, visceral fat, accumulates underneath the neck as well, and that can lead to this obstructive sleep apnea, which is where you basically struggle to get air in through the night. And some people don't even know they've got it; they'll just know that they snore a lot. But ultimately, if you get disrupted airways in the middle of the night, you end up with little bouts of hyperarousal through the night. So as soon as you're going to go into deep sleep, it stops you. So you never get good quality deep sleep. You're just in and out of Rem sleep and awakening through the night. You're not allowed to reset any of your cortisol levels, and that is not great. The easy answer is a CPAP machine. So if people do think they've got issues with that, they can get a high pressure oxygen system that keeps the airways patent and open, and that can work quite well. And just an example, that issue of the metabolic syndrome, this statistic here was quite useful because I'm nearly 45. 45 years older who sleep less than 6 hours a night, twice as likely to have a heart attack or stroke in their lifetimes compared to those with 7 hours or more. The difference is marginal, but actually the effect on your health is huge. And this chap here, Walker, wrote a brilliant book, which I'll show you at the end, Why We Sleep. He's a neuroscientist that's made it his thing to really create a difference in the way that the governments deal with sleep as an epidemic. He's done some great stuff. So, we go on from obesity to inflammation and how those two things are actually linked. Inflammation, as most people would know, more of that is not a good thing. So, just on one night's sleep, on a poor night's sleep, you will get this pro-inflammatory cytokines flooding into the system. These are basically messenger cells that tell other parts of the immune system to kick up a fuss. So that only happens on one night. And cortisol also raises, as we've said before, if you're not getting good sleep. So over time, and this is a point I want to just use the example of insulin again, over time cortisol elevation, which is a natural anti-inflammatory because it's a steroid, so when your doctor gives you a steroid, reduces inflammation, cortisol does that. So it's very usefully it does that. But over time, it becomes less efficient at doing it. So your body keeps pumping out cortisol because you're chronically stressed as opposed to just bouts of stress. And instead of it being a really good anti-inflammatory agent, in the same way that insulin works for type 2 diabetes, insulin's flooded into the system and it wants to attach to the receptors on the cells. When that happens, that activates the cell to open its door and blood sugar goes in, it activates a response. Over time, With cortisol, those receptors to cortisol downregulate in the same way that insulin receptors downregulate. So it's a bit like having a coffee a day then leads to you having to have 2 coffees a day. You get downregulation of caffeine receptors. It's the same principle. So over time you can keep flooding the system with cortisol and it's no longer having its anti-inflammatory effect, even though it should be. So, and the other one we've touched on before, cortisol increases levels of visceral fat, so it makes you obese, particularly central obesity. But what we do know now is that visceral fat in particular is an organ in itself, and that can be quite harmful because as an organ, it tends to want to then flood the system with inflammatory chemicals. So white fat increases inflammation. Brown fat is the opposite. Brown fats are good fat, and actually the more obese you are, the less brown fat you get. The more lean you are, the more brown fat you've got, which is an interesting thing. But brown fat's your friend and white fat is not. White fat will just keep plugging away inflammation into the system. And when I say to patients, I think it's useful if you lose a bit of weight, of course, people think they've got to lose a stone or 2 because they think about the actual weight. But if you lose weight, the first fat that you get rid of is your white fat, and you only need to lose a little bit of it to change the amount of inflammation going in the system. 3 or 4 pounds can often change a lot of people's pain. And it's probably through the chemical way that they're losing the pain, or reducing the pain, rather than the actual weight through the joints. So it doesn't need to be a lot, it just needs to be here that you lose it, or around your chops like me. So, and the immune system is complex. So any questions about that, ask the good doctor afterwards, so I get a bit confused with the immune system. But all I do know is that dysregulation is a good get-out word. Ultimately, the immune system gets a bit not right. Apart from the cortisol thing, which we know gets desensitized, there's lots of other things at play here. And we know that poor sleep does a number of things. The big one here where I've underlined is that cancer risk doubles with sleeping less than 6 hours. That's all getting a bit depressing this morning, but it is a fact that your risk of cancer, all cause cancers, all the cancers will go up with poor sleep. And even after one night, the natural killer cells, these are things that float around your body saying there's a cell there that's slightly misshapen, which is ultimately precancerous. The cells reproduce all the time, and a lot of them reproduce in funny ways. And your natural killer cells are all the time, every day and every night, going around and killing them. And 70% reduction in one night of poor sleep, less than 6 hours. So that's a pretty good correlation with poor sleep there. And this was just a small bit of the book. If anyone wants that link afterwards, that summed all of that up really nicely. So what can we do if we can try and be positive about anything? Actually, some of the things are really easy to do, and sleep hygiene's something that everyone's heard of a little bit. And it's simple, but it's actually really hard to get right, because most people that come to see me in practice, and they've heard of it, and they say, well, I've taken out the electricals in the room, and it's not really made any difference to that. But what you have to do, especially if a problem has been going on for a long time, either you're chronic inflammatory based pain or you're struggling to lose weight and so forth, and you know your sleep is not great, you have to do all of them. Unless you do all of them, nothing really changes. You have to create a sort of sense of momentum with everything. So the first thing is just get people to understand that the bedroom is just for sleep. A few other things, but just for sleep. It really is just a shrine to go into. So your body's like habit, they like routine. So if you enter your bedroom, you know that's the only thing that's going to happen pretty much, is sleep. It's not watching TV. You don't want your brain triggered by other things that is, oh, well, every time I go into the bedroom, I always read for half an hour, or I always watch TV for half an hour, or play with my phone, watching the BBC News. You know, so that it needs to be that your brain says, that's where I'm going to go to sleep. And psychologically, that's really useful for people to just understand that that's it. Get rid of everything. So it's not just that you get rid of the TV because of the light and so forth. It's that your brain doesn't want to get used to the fact that that's what you're doing. It wants to just go to sleep. The no TV electricals is really about this idea of light, and the fact that even our standby light on a TV will go through your eyelids and it will trigger serotonin, or rather it will inhibit melatonin production. So even standby lights on TVs and alarm clocks and so forth, they need not to be in there. You can go to the level where you wear an eye mask and an earplug. I do, don't mind saying, because I've got rubbish blinds, I haven't got blackout blinds, but actually it makes a hell of a difference. The 1 hour before is an issue of blue light. So blue light's the real thing that stops you producing melatonin, and that is basically your phone, your computer, and everything else. And you need to give a chance to get your melatonin going, so you get really good deep phase sleep. So about an hour before you go to bed, you can get apps that turn off the blue light. Flux is a really good one. I use that, it's really great. So you basically, your computer goes a bit orange, your phone goes a bit orange, and then you can use it a little bit more. But actually, it all involves stimulation. So you should probably always have an hour off before you go to bed of no electricals, no TV, reading a book or listening to the radio or music is fine. It doesn't seem to be nearly so bad. LED lights, which are now very, in vogue because they save a lot of money, they've got really good blue light, put it another way, bad blue light. They've got a blue light spectrum that's just really strong in LED light. So you can get LED lights that are less, but ultimately they're not great. So if you had a room that you always were in before you went to bed, you're better off having that room not have a spectrum of blue light in it, in effect. That's just changing a few light bulbs up. The core temperature, your body temperature will try and reduce itself to get into deep phase sleep. Your core temperature reduces a bit. So what you want to do is make that really easy. Make it easy on yourself. Hot bath reduces core temperature, weirdly enough. So if you have that before bed, that's what helps you really get into deep phase sleep, because your body responds as a homeostatic mechanism, drops your core temperature in response to the heat. So if you can do that, that would be great, or just basically opening a window so you get some fresh air in. Alcohol, that's a really bad one, because that, as we all know, if you've had a stressful day, you have a glass of wine, it calms you down, it makes you nice and soporific, you nod off to sleep, and you think it's done your power good. It absolutely fragments your sleep. So what that does, your 4 cycles a night, it turns into about 8 cycles, and you never go into deep sleep. So you cannot get rid of all your adenosine because you're not getting deep sleep. So when you wake up in the morning, a lot of people think that hangover is because alcohol's poisoned you. Probably at least half the symptoms of the morning, which is you want to eat loads of rich fatty foods and salty things and you feel pretty rubbish, is the effect on your fragmented sleep, not just that alcohol's a terrible thing. So that is something to avoid. Don't lie in bed awake if you wake up in the middle of the night. All the research tells us that what you should do, instead of lying there hoping you go back to bed, you want the bedroom, again, going back to number 1 point, is you want the bedroom to be synonymous with sleep. But if you're lying there for 45 minutes thinking what you're going to do the next day, going through your checklist of things, awake, your body gets used to then that, oh, this is what I do at 3 o'clock every morning. And you'll get into a habit, because bodies like habits. So you should get up, you should go downstairs, do some work, and whatever it is that makes you tired. Don't go on your computer or anything else. Make a list on a bit of paper and go through a few things and do it till you're tired. And then go back into the bedroom when you're tired. Don't wait to be tired in the bedroom. So the experts tell me what I've read. So that's basically sleep hygiene. There are other things that are out there in research that tell us that it's good to do during the day. Most of these, get outside in the morning, shift your melatonin into serotonin. So your body knows that you've stopped sleeping and now you're awake. So you should get up and you should look at the sky, not the sun. Get the blue light really washing in the system, and melatonin converts in effect to serotonin. It's a bit of a complex pathway, but the more melatonin you've got, the more serotonin you've got. And the more serotonin you've got by getting out midday, getting out in the sunlight, so not getting straight into your car, straight to office, spend 15 minutes getting serotonin converted from melatonin. And then at the end of the day, you've got more in the bank to convert to melatonin. So get out at least 15 minutes and do that. Get up at the same time every day. Habit again, bodies like habits. If people have slept in at the weekends, they often know that they didn't feel particularly good for it. So your body likes to get 7.5, whatever you do, 7.5, 8 hours. It would like for you to get up at the same time. Otherwise you would jet lag yourself. If you spend another hour or 2 in bed, you don't necessarily feel better for it. Bodies like habit and routine. So try and stick to the same time that you go to bed and the same time you get up. The naps, anything more than 20 minutes will reduce that balloon of adenosine we talked about. So 20 minutes maximum, that would be great, because anything more than 20 minutes you might go into deep sleep, which then purges your adenosine, as I said earlier. So you end up getting the end of the day and your balloon is not so full, and you won't feel like you want to go to sleep. So you minimum 20 minutes, maximum 20 minutes before for a nap. Caffeine's a real problem, as we all know. It's not just that it's a stimulant, which it is, but it's got a really high affinity for adenosine receptors, this chemical we're talking about all the time. So you're trying to whack in adenosine into the brain, and your receptors want to latch on to, or the adenosine wants to attach onto all these receptors. But caffeine, unfortunately, has got a stronger affinity for the same receptors. So your adenosine, for it to turn all the light switches off in the bedroom, that can't happen in the presence of caffeine. So you're not going to get it. And it's got a 6-hour half-life. So if you have a coffee at 12 o'clock, you've got half the amount of caffeine still floating around at 6 o'clock. So if you have 2 coffees, to say it another way, 2 coffees at 12 o'clock, it's almost like having a fresh coffee at 6 o'clock, which most people would know that's probably a bit late to do, right? If you have a strong coffee, it's the same thing. It's still floating around the system for 6 hours. So probably just as wise to have coffee maybe 10, 11 o'clock in the morning and then nothing else afterwards. And people don't get called out, things like ice cream, things like chocolate, particularly the darker the chocolate, they all are caffeine sources. So if you're having dessert and it's a dark chocolate, this, that and the other, followed by a cup of tea, you're not far off having a coffee. And you will not get this build-up of sleep pressure going on. And a lot of people realise that they can get the circadian rhythm right, so they've done all of that right, but they're lying in bed feeling really tired, but yet they can't go off to sleep. And that's the sort of caffeine effect, stopping you getting your adenosine levels working. Exercise in the evenings. It's a bit of a moot point, but if people have got particular issues with sleep, if they haven't, then it probably isn't a big issue. But you'll spike your cortisol because it's a stress. It affects exercise, particularly more intense exercise. So if people have got sleep issues, they probably would be really sensible to do it in the morning, which correlates well with cortisol rising in the morning anyway. So they may as well do it at the same time as they're going to raise their cortisol. But doing it at night, as I said before, that inhibits melatonin if you exercise a lot at night. There's a bit of evidence for magnesium, vitamin D. They're the main minerals that have got some evidence to say that will help you sleep. It calms you down, pretty much. Vitamin D does a whole host of things. Cherries, reasonable evidence as well, they've got melatonin in cherries. So if you're struggling a bit in winter to get your serotonin and then convert, so cherries in the winter might be a good idea to have with your dessert now and then. And a general anti-inflammatory diet, because as I say, if you've got these sleep issues that are giving you obesity and inflammation, general oily fish, dark green vegetables, those sorts of things will be a sensible, clean eating option to do. The fasting goes back to what I talked about with this idea of receptor insensitivity or downregulation. Talk about the insulin and the fact that the receptors are no longer listening to the insulin. It happens with anything. So ultimately, over time, you become desensitive, your receptors do. Fasting, ultimately starving yourself, tells the cells to become sensitive again, which makes sense. It's almost pressing a reset switch on all of your cells to say, basically, you need to be really responding when insulin comes in, or when you've got cortisol coming in. It tends to press a reset switch on all of the things, including the hypothalamus for all of the hunger hormones. So fasting for 16 hours seems to be the sweet spot, 16 hours. It sounds like hard work, but if the maths is right, if you finish eating at 8 o'clock, skip breakfast, which sounds like a really contentious thing to say, then you go through to midday, 2 o'clock, that would be great. A whole host of other things happen to do with your guts as well. They clean themselves out and all sorts of give a big enough break. But fasting is one of those things that I thought when I first heard it might come and go as a bit of a fad, but actually it's gone the other way. The research is now just mounting. It's some element of fasting. Whether it be 3-4 days a week or whatever else, but overnight fasting is the easiest way to do it because you're asleep, so what do you know about it? It's not too hard to get around that one. And if you've got particularly bad sleep issues, CBT and mindfulness, that's there for people that have got insomnia, which means they've got really disrupted sleep for about 3 days a week, and that continues for 3 months, and that's ultimately seeing your GP and having discussions about that. That's another level on. So, going back to what I said at the start, why do I do it as an osteopath? It's really important for people's chronic pain, that if they're sleeping well, I see it in my patients, they will have less pain. It's as simple as that. The less inflammation, the less pain in principle, apart from some strange things out there. And I think because we had an audience today with personal trainers and health professionals, Smith Brothers, that ultimately, if people are going to have a conversation about losing weight or stubborn weight loss, or they're in pain even with their weight loss or whatever issues they've got, the conversation is 95% always going to be, well, you've got to exercise more, and you've got to really focus on your diet. It's almost lip service at the end, like you sleep right. But all the evidence tells us that if you're an average person, it's going to be roughly split a third each way. You've got to be tackling the sleep as well as you've got to be tackling the diet, as well as you've got to be tackling the exercise. The exercise, if someone's not exercising at all, probably the most important thing is they start exercising out of all of those. That's probably the most evidence. If they don't exercise, they've got to start exercising to try and do anything with their bodies. But if someone's exercising reasonably, and the diet's reasonable, it's more evidence to say that you need to tackle the sleep. Doing more of the diet and more of the exercise probably is missing a huge chunk of why they've got stubborn weight loss and not losing the weight that they want to lose. Does that make sense? Apart from the fact that stress management is also important, but that's really hard. I'll leave that one to my colleague. So, does that all make sense? Is there any questions on that before we tip over?
Could you supplement with melatonin as well?
Pardon?
Could you supplement with melatonin?
You can't in this country, unfortunately. I don't think even you can prescribe it, can you? No. So in America, you can go to a Holland & Barrett equivalent, and you can get it online, dark web. I'm not suggesting you do, but people use it over there, and I have used it myself when I was in America in my previous career, and we all used it all the time because we were going racing around the world doing some motorway stuff, and it works. It's great. Doesn't seem to be any side effects, and for some reason, maybe Vijay will answer later, it's just not prescribable over here, and you can't buy it. No idea why.
If not, there are other things you can get on the dark web.
There are, yeah. You can. There is. If you're going to like shift workers and people that just struggle to do the things, then there are a few supplements out there and a few food groups that help to build melatonin, like tryptophans in your food. We haven't gone too much into that, but you can get something called 5-HTP as a supplement, and a few other things. St. John's Wort works in a similar way with serotonin. So there are things you can manipulate in your diet to help boost levels of melatonin, but probably nowhere near as good as getting out in the midday sun and whacking your serotonin up, which then converts to melatonin later on. So, but as I say, there comes a point where you have to be pragmatic and say that person's shift working, and they can't do that. You know, that's hard. Yeah. No more questions? Sleepiness. So should we convert over? And you're going to take over, is that all right?
Thank you all for coming today and giving up your Saturday afternoon or part of it to hear us talk. I hope this will be an interesting insight into how functional medicine is a way of a new perspective of treating patients with illness and disease. So first, a little bit about me. My name is Vijay. I'm a GP at Ixworth Surgery, which is about 5 miles from Bury St Edmunds. I've been an NHS doctor for almost 20 years now. During that time, I've worked through a large number of different specialities. Initially, early on in my career, I was thinking I was going to be an orthopaedic surgeon, and so that's where my career was heading. And during that time in the surgical rotation, I found myself slightly different to my peers in that I enjoyed every single job that I did. So every time we moved on, I found myself missing some of the skills I'd learned from the last job. And I started to doubt whether that was for me to specialise in such a specialised area. So I explored other options and finally decided on general practice. And since I made that decision, there's no looking back. I really enjoy my job. So in general practice, what I really like is that I get to work with a wide range of different patients, ranging from small newborn babies all the way to end-of-life care. And I get to step back, occasionally take a really holistic approach. So what is a general practitioner? I mean, we all know of someone or been up to see our GPs. A general practitioner is a physician, so we largely treat people without surgery, who is trained to treat both acute and chronic illness. Now in medicine, acute and chronic are two words which basically mean length of time. So acute illnesses are illnesses which have not been there for very long. Chronic, that word in medicine means that it's been there for usually about 3 months or longer. We provide preventative care and health education to patients. Well, it's on the job description. In reality, it's not so easy. The model that we work in the NHS, which is hugely pressurised, means that we see people roughly every 10 minutes. So on an average day, I'd see about 30 patients face to face. And if you look at patient interactions altogether, that means seeing patients, dealing with them on the telephone, dealing with other health professionals, letters, results. Altogether, you're looking at over 100 patient interactions. So that's about 10 minutes per patient face to face, but actually when you're dealing with letters and blood results, you're looking more likely about 60 seconds per interaction. So on a busy day especially, we find ourselves just juggling the whole time. It's no wonder that we've developed this one problem per consultation type approach in general practice, which isn't ideal, but given the pressures, as I mentioned, if my colleagues and myself were to offer 20-minute consultations, although it would be easier and better for us and the patients would like it, that means that the average patient would be waiting maybe twice as long. So it's not really a practical solution given the workforce that we have. So early on in my career, I explored other avenues of healthcare. I realised that there was a subset of patients that were not optimally helped through our conventional practice. So I explored the British Institute of Musculoskeletal Medicine and did a modular course over 2 years with them. And that was really eye-opening. It was run by some doctors who were dual trained as osteopaths and conventional doctors as well. And so first time that I've seen things like osteopathy, massage therapy and acupuncture, all these things are used, and they have excellent results with it. At the time, embarrassed to say I was a bit sceptical, but after seeing the results, there was no question really. So following that, I went on to study some acupuncture through the British Medical Acupuncture Society, and I got good results with that too. So this led me on to explore what else was out there, and I came across functional medicine. And once I looked into that in more depth, it made a lot of sense to me. The science made sense, and the approach was really quite novel in terms of really looking at the root cause of why people become ill. So in order to describe functional medicine, I think it's good to contrast it with conventional modern medicine. So for that, we're going to go back about 90 years. So this gentleman here is Robert Fleming. He is a Scottish physician, and he was the person that discovered penicillin. So in his lab, he was growing some mold, which is penicillin, and he noticed that around the penicillin there was less bacteria growth. So they isolated the compound, which we now know is penicillin, and created the first antibiotic. So at the time, that was a magic pill, and ever since it's saved millions of lives. At the time it was created, obviously the main problems to society were infectious diseases and trauma. So this approach, which spawned the kind of modern magic pill, magic bullet type approach, works really well for acute illness. It's kind of people come to you with one problem, it's caused by one thing, which is like an infection, and your solution fits nicely and they get better. The problem with it is that over time, especially with the pressures we face and how fast we see patients, we start to develop this seeing a patient, listening to their symptoms and coming up with the magic pill that will help that symptom. And over time, if only tool that you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, and I think that's kind of how modern medicine has ended up. So this is kind of where we are now. It's a name it, blame it and tame it approach. So in this example, we've got a patient that comes along to the doctor with dry patches of red sore skin. So it's named, given a diagnosis, which is eczema. We blame that tissue as being the problem, and then we tame it with steroid cream. Now, there's nothing wrong with this approach for an exacerbation of eczema, but at some point we need to think, well, why have they got it in the first place? What's causing that inflammation? So fast forward to modern time, and we have a massive problem with chronic illness, which is a completely different kettle of fish. So chronic illness is multifactorial in origin. It develops over long periods of time, sometimes decades, and in many cases it's due to an interplay of a number of factors. Despite this, we still try and shoehorn the old acute medicine approach to fit this, and it doesn't work very well. So what is functional medicine? Functional medicine is a systems biology-based approach to identify and address the root cause of disease. And it engages both patient and practitioner in a therapeutic partnership, much like a physiotherapist or a personal trainer like you guys work. Patient doesn't get better by seeing you, patient doesn't get better by seeing a physiotherapist, but if they work with physiotherapists and they learn how to make themselves better when they do it, then the results are brilliant. So two patients suffering the same condition may have two very different triggers for their problem. So if I give you an example, if you have two patients with psoriasis, which is an inflammatory autoimmune condition producing plaques on the skin, one patient might have that condition because they've got a genetic predisposition for psoriasis, and their trigger happens to be, say, gluten in their diet. That causes a gut inflammation reaction, which then becomes systemic, and then because of their predisposition, their weak point is skin, so they get their psoriasis. The next patient, also with psoriasis, also has the same genetic predisposition, obviously, but that patient may be triggered by a severe and kind of persistent stress. Both patients will turn up to their doctor with the same condition, what you can see, the same symptom, and are likely to be treated the same way with drugs, creams, which are targeting their inflammation on their skin or their inflammatory system, their immune system. Now, the problem with that approach, because it does work, is it will only work while they're taking the drugs. Once they stop taking the drugs, things will get worse again. And the other problem with it is that if there's an inflammatory autoimmune pathology system going on, If that's not addressed, then it's a matter of time until it pops up somewhere else as a second autoimmune inflammatory condition, which we know once you get your first one, you're likely, it's a matter of time until you get your second. So this is another example of how functional medicine works in combination with modern medicine, or traditional medicine, because both are needed, they're very complementary. So here you've got a leak from a bathroom upstairs, and you've got water dripping from the ceiling. You've got someone here dealing with a stain on the ceiling and then the plaster coming across. Obviously the idea is that we want to treat this person's root cause before the whole ceiling falls down. So this chart shows a patient's journey. So this is an average patient here. At this point they've got their optimal health and they move along to having some symptoms. This could be tiredness or bloating or difficulty losing weight. So they'll go along to their MD, so American for doctor, medical doctor, and they'll probably have a number of tests done. And if those tests all come back negative, doctors are kind of like, great, there's nothing wrong with you. What we actually mean is that we're not at a level, you haven't reached a level where we can label you with a condition and a disease, and so therefore we haven't got anything to offer you. So these patients may go away feeling relieved that they haven't got a significant disease, but more likely they'll go away frustrated that they still don't feel well and no one's offered them any treatment for that. So move forwards to functional medicine, and the idea is that we listen to the symptoms and we try and work with a systems biology approach to see what's going wrong that might be giving them those symptoms. We're not so focused on the giving them the diagnosis. That doesn't matter so much because the treatment's not based on you've been given a label of psoriasis or you've been given a label of diabetes, and we can restore them back to their optimal health. So a major principle of functional medicine is understanding that every system in the body is closely connected, much like a web, and the body is designed to be self-healing. Given the right environment to do so, it can rebalance itself really nicely. So I'm going to talk about 7 core principles of functional medicine, and I'll go through each one at a time. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour because of the time I have here today. So the first one is understanding the patient's personal health journey. So before I see a patient, I send them a link to an online software called the Living Matrix, and they will invest a couple of hours of their time giving me all the information they can of their kind of health journey. And this starts from even before they're born, so often they have to ask their parents. Factors such as parental illness can be very important, and it can give me a clue of their genetic predispositions. Their birth history, whether they had a caesarean section, whether they were breastfed or bottle fed, these things help me to know whether there might have been a problem affecting their gut microbiome, even at a very early age. And sometimes these problems can be compounded by the use of antibiotics, even in mum during labour or as a baby. Once I've got all this information, the software plots it onto a functional medicine timeline. And where this is slightly different to how we take a past medical history at work in conventional medicine, is that it's not just listing of diagnoses. So in regular medicine, when you see a doctor, they want to know whether you've got a history of asthma, COPD, high blood pressure. These are all conditions which have been labelled. And here what we're doing is, we're obviously using those things, they're important. I also get information that they have about recent tests and scans. But I'm also interested in symptoms, like we said, with tiredness and bloating. So these are all mapped onto the timeline, and it also includes personal key life events. So whether you've had some stressful events like a divorce or a bereavement, whether you've moved house, whether you've got a new job or a new pet because it might introduce new allergens into your environment, and all of this goes onto the timeline. When you then take a step back, you get this really holistic approach where you can see that someone was drifting along with their optimal health up until a certain point in time, and then once they've reached that time point, they start to collect symptoms and then diseases. In addition to the timeline, the software also maps all the symptoms that you have onto something called the Functional Medicine Matrix. And that's again a systems biology approach which can show me where I'm going to get most benefit to focus my initial treatment on. It's very rare to see someone who has all their problems in one system biology. If you see someone with tiredness, for example, there's going to be a lot of area in the energy system biology section of the matrix, but there'll also be stuff in the assimilation where the gut is and hormones, because it's all interconnected. So moving on, the second principle is recognizing the gut as a major gateway into disease. So we've all heard the phrase, we are what we eat. I'm sure we agree with that to some extent. What would be even better is to take a step back and look at we are what we digest. So when I went to medical school 20 years ago or so, we knew the gut as an organ which is to do with digestion and excretion, and that was pretty much it. We now know that the gut does a lot more than that, and there's a lot of research into this area. There has been a lot of research in the last 10 years. So the gut has 70% of our immune system located in it, which seems a bit odd, but when you consider that the gut is our main interface with the outside world and our environment, that comes unsurprising. It's natural to think of the skin as our main interface with the world, but actually if you look at the surface area of the skin versus the surface area of the gut wins. It also produces brain neurotransmitters. 90% of serotonin, as James was talking about, is produced in the gut. So if you have the right components needed, you need sunlight, you need exercise, you need protein, then the gut can go ahead and do its job. If it's unhealthy and it's not producing enough serotonin, then that may be a patient who turns up at the doctor's surgery complaining of symptoms of depression, but no obvious reason for it. There's no obvious trigger. The gut is home to the microbiome. I don't know how much you all know about the microbiome, but again, it's a massive area of research in the last 10 years. The human microbiome is pretty fascinating, really. The number of bacterial cells in our body outnumbers us by 10 to 1. That makes us more bacterial cells than human, which means that we're walking around basically as a superorganism, like an ecosystem. If you look at the amount of bacterial genetic material compared to human, then we're outnumbered by 100 to 1. So this is a vital part of us as humans. We've evolved with bacteria, and there are quite different. There's a lot of differences in different populations around the world, and this can influence our own DNA, expressing certain genes or inhibiting certain genes. Sorry, to make quite profound differences in the way we metabolize. So apart from that, the other symptoms, other functions of the gut we already know: breaks down food, absorbs nutrients, but also keeps out toxins when the barrier function is working well. So we have about 100 trillion of friends inside us right as we speak now. I'm sure many of you have heard of leaky guts. It's quite a buzz term at the moment in the media, in the papers. Many of my doctor colleagues don't understand this fully. Probably not on board with it, partly because of the name. There is a scientific name for this, which is called increased intestinal permeability. But what you have here is the lining of the gut. It's called the epithelial lining. It's only one cell thick, so it's incredibly thin. These cells here are the epithelial cells. They're normally tightly packed like a terrace house. And in between there are tight junctions here, helping to keep them packed. So on the top here is the inside of the gut, the lumen, and that's where the food and everything else is moving along. And then underneath is a simplified version of your systemic circulation. So for diagrammatic purposes, this is a blood cell, and anything enters here is now in your system circulation. So normally, food particles come down here, and these cells, the epithelial cells, carefully vet whether they can come in or not, much like a security system in a nightclub. Over time, depending on if they have exposure to toxins or food sensitivities, these cells start to move apart, they loosen. So here we have like terrace houses going to detached houses. So these gaps are now basically problems with the security. So you can get particles of food, toxins, pathogens now enter into the systemic circulation much more freely. So for example, if you have a particle of gluten that you've eaten from bread, and that leaks through. It now enters a systemic circulation where it encounters our immune system. So that leads me on to the immune system and how to regulate it and reduce inflammation, some of which you've heard the talk from James earlier. So our immune system is much like our body's armed forces, and when it works properly, it knows to identify self from non-self, and it also knows when to tolerate foreign substances, such as nutrients from the food that we eat. Acute inflammation is a normal physiological response to damage, and it's very positive. It's something we've evolved to have. However, chronic inflammation signifies loss of tolerance and causes a lot of damage to our tissues. So, next few slides are missing, but I will go off the top of my head. This is a study that was done on fast food, and what they found, they were looking at a complex protein called NF-kappa B, or nuclear factor kappa B, and this is a complex protein which upregulates inflammation. It actually goes into DNA, into the nucleus of the cell, and upregulates how the body responds to inflammation. So think of that particle like the army guy, but this time carrying a bazooka. Okay, so these are the big guns. They also looked at inhibitor kappa B, which is basically like his boss, going around with him, making sure he doesn't go trigger happy. And what they found was, after one fast food meal, within an hour of ingestion, NF-kappa B goes up, so you're getting more bazooka guys coming along, and inhibitor factor B goes down, so they've all got itchy trigger fingers as well. So once you've upregulated inflammation, that process takes over 3 hours to even start coming down. Now the problem here is that the average person's eating meals maybe every 4 or 5 hours, often snacking on junk food as well. I have patients that have told me that they take crisps to bed, they have chocolate bars next to their bed, so they're not even keeping full night's fast. And so if they're keeping this inflammatory process up high, what they've done other studies to also show that if you keep stimulating this process, the upregulation of inflammation will be constant. And once that happens, you're not going to notice that the meals that you eat, the food that you eat, is causing extra inflammation in your body, because you feel no different. You feel bad all the time. And your arthritis, which may be mild, is going to be irritated by chemical inflammation, and you're going to have much more joint pain. When you go and see the doctor and get an x-ray, the arthritis may come back as mild, but your symptoms are not keeping with that. This is a quote by a previous President of the United States, and it's quite fitting with autoimmune conditions. The problem in defense is how far you can go without destroying from within what you're trying to defend from without. So going with immune problems is also inflammation. We all know people that have one or more than one of these disorders: asthma, colitis, joint pains, psoriasis we talked about, eczema, but even heart disease has an inflammatory basis, stomach ulcers, sinusitis, all very common stuff. So anything we can do to reduce inflammation in our body, we heard about how better sleep does that, anything we can do will benefit not just one but lots of these disorders. So how can we influence inflammation? I should have put sleep on there, shouldn't I, James? Yeah.
Indeed.
We can reduce processed food in our diet, like we saw in that research study. But more tricky than that is actually removing healthy food from our diet, which that individual has a problem with. So if you have a sensitivity to a certain food, it can be a healthy food, it can be eggs, it can be nuts. On that person, that individual, it's going to cause an inflammatory reaction. And unfortunately, unlike an allergy, such as a nut allergy, you're not going to get instant feedback. You're not going to eat something and then immediately get swelling or rashes or lip, tongue swelling, tinkling. You're going to get a reaction which potentially is gradual and lasts for 3 weeks. And so for someone that has a problem with gluten, for example, if they had one slice of bread every 3 weeks, they're going to hardly remember eating bread. But they're going to have, potentially, if they're very sensitive, a reaction which is constant. We're going to try and increase anti-inflammatory foods, such as leafy green vegetables, omega-3, and turmeric. We're going to manage their stress, which I'll go over a bit later. We're going to try and increase activity and exercise. However, sometimes we need to decrease it. If you're dealing with someone who has a stressful job and is not sleeping well, not eating very much, if that person decides they're going to try and run a marathon as a challenge for charity or whatever, they're going to put their body under a lot more stress and a lot more inflammation. So for some people, it's a case of understanding that they can't push their body too much and backing off. Chronic hidden infections is a source of inflammation. Most of the time that's in the gut. We all know, a lot of people are on anti-acid medication now. They suppress acid because of reflux. I haven't got time to go into the causes of that, but as a result of suppressing the acid, you change the natural environment of your upper gut. And when you reduce acid, you're allowing an environment which other bacteria can now proliferate. Previously they couldn't because of the acidic environment, but now they can. So you can get small bowel overgrowth of bacteria. Coming down from there is toxins, heavy metals and pesticides. These are all big problems in society, partly because we are exposed to more toxins, but also because of our processed food diets and lack of efficient detox. We're not able to get rid of it. So this is one of my favourites. This is my favourite slide from the talk. Now going back to the last one, all of these things, each of these interventions that you put in place may not be very powerful, but together they work very synergistically, like this group of guys pushing a bus. There is another way of doing it as well. On the right you've got Mariusz Pudzianowski, world's strongest man, 5 times. This would be the equivalent of a pharmaceutical creation which is so powerful that it can get the job done alone. Moving on to the next core principle, this is optimizing mitochondrial function. So as we know, mitochondria are organelles in all our cells, and they're responsible for converting food energy into ATP, which is the body's currency for energy, via the citric acid cycle. Some cells, like a sperm cell, has got about 50 mitochondria. Other cells, like in your heart, about 5,000 mitochondria. These are tiny little energy producing factories. And we can look after them, put them in a healthy environment where they're going to work well, or we can put them in an unhealthy environment where they're not going to work as well, and that's called a dysfunction. Again, with my colleagues, like with the leaky gut, mitochondrial ill health is quite a controversial area. And the reason for that is there are a few, quite rare, I've never come across them, mitochondrial disorders, which are genetic, where the mitochondria don't work properly, and they're quite severe diseases. What we're dealing with is slight dysfunctions. And so we're not talking about a light switch being on or off, we're talking about a dimmer switch where it's not quite at full effect. When there's a deficiency of vital cofactors or vitamins, what we'll see is in the Krebs cycle, we'll see a build-up of one metabolite, and at the next step we'll see a drop-off where they'll be very low. And what we can tell there is that there's been a reduction in the efficiency of that particular step in the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. Almost every chronic illness has got some level of dysfunction of the mitochondria, and that's why often people will feel tired for quite a long time before they then later on, maybe years later, develop a disease which we label someone with. So the problem has been going on for a long time. And if you address that and deal with the mitochondrial dysfunction, then people notice a big improvement in energy. Although it goes back to the previous slide of pushing the bus, it's one of those people that you're helping. It's not going to, it's not often going to be the massive effect like a drug would be. So this is the Krebs cycle. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but this is just where, this is how an advanced functional medicine test looking to energy production would present things to me. So you'd see the Krebs cycle, you'd see each metabolite there, and if you had, for example, a lack of zinc, or you had a problem with not enough iron, you would have a problem with one of these steps in metabolism. So how do we optimize mitochondrial function? We first and foremost remove the foot from the brake pedal. We try and eliminate as much as possible exposure to cyanide and carbon monoxide, which Sounds easy, but people smoke, and these gases are in cigarette smoke, so they're poisoning their mitochondria. BPA's in plastics, heavy metals, medications such as statins, even paracetamol. These are all medications which have an effect on mitochondrial health. And again, very important to realise we're not talking about someone on statins switching off their mitochondria not working. We're talking about just a slight dysfunction. But add them together, and if you have a lot of these things, it's going to have a big effect on your ability to produce energy. So going on, we've got alcohol, we've got hypoglycemia, so high blood sugar. Obviously addressing micronutrient deficiencies such as magnesium, calcium, vitamin B12, zinc and iron. Avoiding hypoxia, very important, and James spoke about sleep apnea. So this is a big problem in society. Not everyone knows, in fact a lot of people don't know that they've got sleep apnea. People that sleep alone wouldn't often know, they just know they don't feel that well and feel a bit more tired. People that sleep next to someone else, if they notice that they are pausing in their breathing for 10 seconds or longer, that's quite significant, especially if it's happening frequently through the night. And although it stops sleep and has the knock-on effects on inflammation, it also causes mitochondrial disturbance. And it's a big risk factor for heart disease. Anyone pretty much with a neck over 17 inches is very likely to be suffering from sleep apnea. So we want to try and reduce inflammation using the methods previously, and James touched on intermittent fasting. Huge benefits to the mitochondria from intermittent fasting. The next core principle is enhancing detoxification. So we can detoxify if we have the right nutrients coming in, and again, the right environment. So we want to minimise toxic exposures, but we live in an environment where a baby, maybe 3-4 months old, is exposed to more toxins than its great-grandfather would have been in their lifetime. We're just surrounded by chemicals in everything. So it's very important that our body can detoxify effectively. And if the detoxification pathways are working well, then we can deal with it. Much like if someone's drinking alcohol, which is a toxin, and if they're drinking it within the recommended limits and they have a normal healthy liver, it's not a problem, we can detoxify. But if someone's got a liver that's damaged and not working, not detoxifying, that person, forget the alcohol recommendation limits, that person can't drink, because if they do, it's going to build up. So foods that help with detoxification is cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, and that's why broccoli is considered a superfood. Curcumin, the active ingredient of turmeric, and we want to optimise gut health, as we said before, to help mobilise and excrete these toxins. We want a good amount of soluble fibre and fluid intake so that we don't get constipated. Exercise in the saunas through sweating helps us to detoxify. And there are a lot of people that go a week without ever breaking a sweat. I guess there's some people that go through a training session without breaking a sweat. So coming down to hormones. Hormones are really complex, and I knew they were really complex anyway, but after studying functional medicine, it really blew me away how connected everything is. The body has the ability for homeostasis. It likes to adapt to what it's going through. So often imbalances in hormones, if you look at them isolated, it looks like a disorder. But if you look at the big picture, the body's trying to do something. So what causes hormone dysfunction? All the things we've talked about so far in terms of being overweight, toxins, nutritional deficiencies, not sleeping enough, food intolerances, all these things. Now I won't go through this in detail. It's actually simpler than it looks. This is a steroid pathway. Up here, it's not clear on there, up here that molecule there is cholesterol. And at the bottom you've got aldosterone and cortisol, which are stress hormones. Over here we've got testosterone, and here estrogen and progesterone up there. So cholesterol is seen as like a bad guy in the media. Most people are worried or concerned about their cholesterol, but actually it's a natural substance, we need it, and the body produces it anyway. It's a precursor for all these helpful hormones. So what this shows is that each arrow, is different coloured arrow, is a different enzyme. And if you're going through, say, a lot of stress, your body prioritises the stress response because it's got evolutionary benefits over sexual reproduction, for example. So at periods of stress, your body is going to upregulate these hormones, these enzymes, and help your body to produce more cortisol and aldosterone. So the pathway is going to preferentially go downwards this way. As a result, there's going to be less going progesterone to testosterone to estrogen. Okay, so if we do a test on someone with a low testosterone, it's easy to see that as a body's not making enough testosterone, but there's a reason why it's shifted away from making as much testosterone. And that reason, if it's addressed, the body will kind of rebalance itself. So this is the same diagram actually, but it's got, we can't read it on here, but it's got factors which influence those enzymes, whether they upregulate them or downregulate them. Here, this one is testosterone. This enzyme is aromatase, and that moves testosterone and converts it to estrogen. So things like lack of sleep, increased stress, high blood sugar, they will induce that enzyme to work better and more effectively, and you'll move your testosterone towards estrogen. So understanding how these things can occur, it's possible to manipulate enzymes and actually boost someone's testosterone without actually giving them exogenous testosterone. Bear in mind again, the way that the body does this homeostasis, it tends to be quite subtle. So often someone feeling that they've got low symptoms of low testosterone, if they go and see the doctor, the test will be done, testosterone will be low but not abnormal, and they'll be told it's normal, probably normal for your age. When actually there is quite a lot that can be done in terms of supplements, nutritional supplements, and then modifying their lifestyle, training with resistance training, all these things that have influences in here and actually will help to reduce that aromatase conversion to estrogen, and thereby get the end result, which is boosting that person's testosterone and improve their symptoms. So come lastly to stress management. It's difficult to do. We all have quite stressful lifestyles, especially in the West, but I'd say worldwide. It's difficult to change the stresses. It's not impossible. I mean, I've had occasionally patients who have had so much difficulty with ongoing stress that they've moved away from London, for example, changed from a high-powered job to take something they actually enjoy doing, and accepted the reduction in pay. They've changed from a big house with a big mortgage to a smaller house where they've got more freedom with their time because they haven't got the stress of the mortgage payments. But in reality, most people can't make those massive changes. So these are interventions that can be done to actually help someone deal with their stress a lot better. So we've got prioritised sleep, we've heard plenty of, we've got exercise, yoga, meditation, mindfulness. There's a lot of apps now that can teach people to do these things. And the research says that even within 5 minutes per day of doing these things, it can reset your hormones quite effectively. I sometimes tell patients to look up these meditation apps and do them for 5 minutes at lunchtime, so that, or evening, before their evening meal, because just resetting their nervous system from the fight or flight, which we end up in, especially at evening times, mums especially, they get so stressed with getting the kids ready for bed and things like this. Their guts are not in a state where they can actually extract all the nutrients from their meal. So they can eat a healthy meal, but they're not really ready. It goes back to that, you are what you digest. They're not ready to digest that food. So if they were to, say, for example, put the kids to bed, sit down, do the 5 minutes of meditation, and then eat their meal, now they're in a much better position. Time with positive people you love. This one's really important because it's very powerful. Avoid toxic relationships and toxic people. It's very difficult to make someone better if they're in a toxic relationship or they've got a toxic friend. Getting rid of that and accepting that you're not going to change people, that people can move on really fast. And then these things, obviously quite well known: relaxing, bath, reading, doing things that you enjoy at least once a week. Sunlight exposure for vitamin D, and just being, one with nature, being outside has been shown to have a great influence on this. So using the same slide again because I enjoy it. All these things, as James said, lots of people have tried these things and they come and say, I've tried those and it hasn't worked. Often by themselves, they're not going to work. You can't use half of these people to push that bus, it's just not going to work. But if you use all of them together, then often the synergistic effect is enough to get the bus moving. I will say when it comes to stress, I deal with a lot of people with the more severe end of depression as well. So sometimes we do have to bring in the Marius, which is the anti-depressant medication. But in my experience, even Marius alone can't push that bus. So what I tend to do is use all the other guys and then put Marius in there as well, and get good results. So this slide here is just to demonstrate that on the left you've got someone that's really struggling to lift that weight, which they want to lift. That signifies someone that's struggling with stress in their life. It's easy for a doctor to say reduce the stress, which is equivalent of you saying reduce the weight. But what would be more effective is to build yourself up to be stronger so that the same weight is easily manageable. Now, I wanted to say that I did kind of promote this as a new way of dealing with medicine and looking at health and illness. But actually, this is a quote from Hippocrates from over 2,000 years ago, which is really at the core of functional medicine, which is let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. So I think he was onto something a long time ago. Thank you very much for listening. That's it.
Any questions?